It's time to review Nights into Dreams for the SEGA Saturn. Before we start, I'm going to make this introduction a little longer since some of you watching this probably won't know about this game and why it's such a big deal with longtime SEGA fans. For those of you who don't know, the SEGA Saturn was SEGA's attempt to get into 3D gaming. Except it kind of wasn't. The console was primarily intended for really good-looking 2D games, but because of the competition from the N64 and the PS1, Sega shoehorned in a couple of processors to allow the system to have 3D graphics. Unfortunately, this ended up making the system really complicated for third-party developers to work on and very difficult to emulate, hence why there aren't that many Saturn emulators about. Adding a complete lack of awesome-looking titles that weren't localized because of an idiot who decided players didn't want 2D games or RPGs, being more expensive than the PlayStation 1 or N64, and particularly not having any Sonic the Hedgehog platformers, you end up with a system that faded into obscurity outside of Japan and was essentially the beginning of the end for Sega's console-making days. However, if anything positive can be said about the SEGA Saturn, it was that Sonic team, who had been stuck developing nothing but Sonic games for the last few years, were able to experiment with all sorts of new IPs that would gain cult followings such as Burning Rangers and today's topic, Nights into Dreams. Nights into Dreams was essentially the spiritual successor to Sonic the Hedgehog since it was not only being made by Sonic Team, but it was being directed by Naoto Oshima, the original character designer of Sonic, programmed and produced by Yuji Naka, the programmer for Sonic 1 and longtime producer of the series, and designed by Takashi Yakuza, current producer of the Sonic series and senior level designer in Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Despite not getting the best sales due to being on the Saturn, Nights has become one of the most beloved Sega games ever developed. Every time there's a Sega crossover game, fans worldwide demand that Nights get in there, to the point where through fan demand alone the character appeared as the flag bearer in Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing before becoming a full-blown character in the game's sequel. There was a Wii-developed sequel released a few years back. Any kind of Nights cameo in Sega games, crossover or not, gets celebrated across the internet. In fact, Shigeru Miyamoto, the man who created Mario and The Legend of Zelda, two of the world's most beloved gaming franchises, even once admitted, if there's one game I regret never creating, it was Nights. And because of how beloved the series was, Sega finally decided to re-release the game that started it all on Xbox Live Arcade, PlayStation Network, and PC in October 2012. This re-release contains both the original Saturn game and a graphically enhanced PlayStation 2 version that was only released in Japan back in 2008, the Christmas Nights demo, and all manner of extras for fans and newcomers alike to enjoy. Coming into this as someone who never played Nights before but has heard all the praise, can the game possibly live up to it? Well, let's fly into the review and find out. The story of Nights centers around two young children named Elliot, a basketball player, and Clarice, a gifted singer. After having a really bad day when Elliot lost a game of basketball against older players and Clarice got stage fright during an audition for a musical, the both of them go to sleep and end up with a nightmare that replays the events of their day. However, the people in the dreams turn into frightening nightmarish creatures that start chasing the two kids around a bizarre psychedelic landscape. Thankfully, they're saved when they encounter a strange and androgynous jester named Nights, who needs help trying to stop the nightmares, those creatures from earlier led by Wiseman the Wicked, who wants to collect special spheres called Idia so he can escape the dream world of Nightopia and take over the real world. As it turns out, Elliot and Clarice have a very rare kind of Idia, the Idia of courage that Wiseman cannot steal, and so they and Nights take to the skies to try to stop Wiseman before he can escape Nightopia and conquer reality. Nights is a 2.5D side-scrolling game where the objective is to collect the other kinds of Idia and complete each level as fast as possible while getting the highest score possible. The controls are very simple. You can move around in 8 directions via the left thumbstick, you boost forward by holding the A button, and can use the left and right bumpers or triggers to perform acrobatic moves while flying. In each level there are 4 mares, that is to say, different courses and paths. You complete each mare by collecting 20 blue chips and flying into a giant sphere, where you obtain the Idia of that path, after which you have to leg it back to the starting point of the course to get to the next mare. After you've completed all 4 of them, you go up against a powerful nightmare which has to be defeated in order to access the next level. Initially, you start as Elliot or Clarice, depending on the level you pick, and you have to walk into a small dome to transform into Nights and be able to fly about. However, you're on a time limit, and if you run out of time, you transform back into the kid and have to get back to the aforementioned dome, or you wake up, ending the game. The same goes for the boss battles. You can't die, but if you run out of time, you wake up. In each level, there are a number of important things. Firstly, there's the aforementioned blue chips that can also be used to add to your high score if you collect any more between getting the idiot and starting the next mare. Then there's star bits, which are used to add links, which is essentially a combo meter of how much you collect that adds to your score. And finally, rings that, when passed through, add to your links and fill up your boost meter. When you face off against the bosses, it's best to do it as quickly as possible, since the quicker you do it, the bigger multiplier you get for your score, increasing it overall. This is necessary because if you have at least a C rank for all levels, you get to access the final stages of the game and get the chance to save the world. Now, before I get on to the downsides and upsides, let me explain that Night seems to be a very Marmite kind of game, so of course not everyone's going to like it. So please understand that this is simply a subjective review, not fact. I only encourage you to just try it out and draw your own conclusions from it while I try and explain what I liked and didn't like about it. Due to it being a game made back in the 90s, there are going to be some aspects that have not aged well. First of all, the game becomes occasionally obtuse, meaning that it's hard at times to figure out what you're supposed to do while flying through a level, or more commonly, trying to beat one of the game's many bosses, something that can potentially put off a number of gamers from going through the rest of the game. Speaking of the bosses, they're also the weakest part of the game. As I said before, figuring out the strategy for each boss can be quite difficult, let alone trying to carry it out the first time around. What makes it worse is that when you do figure it out, they end up becoming really easy to defeat. Now, this is understandable to an extent, given that you are supposed to beat them as quickly as possible. Something also to take note of is that this particular port doesn't have certain features seen in the original version of the game, such as a two-player mode, which is a shame given that the gameplay of Nights would actually fit multiplayer really well, and the fountain of extras in Christmas Nights, in particular the actually rather cool ability to play as Sonic the Hedgehog in Spring Valley. Another major problem is that the game is honestly really short. Each stage takes about 5 or 6 minutes to complete, and you can breeze through both stories in under an hour, which I find really annoying. I mean, it's not that I have an issue with short games or anything, but it's just that given how good the game is, I really wanted to play more of it. Probably the biggest flaw with Nights, however, is that understanding the game and how it works isn't so obvious. Despite the gameplay being very simple, for the most part, trying to wrap your head around it and the logic it brings can be pretty difficult since the game never explains itself on that front, meaning that a lot of players can, and given a number of opinions, will get alienated. I've read a lot of reviews mentioning this, and I have to admit that, well, it's true. But again, I have to say, you still should try it out just to see whether or not you can put up with it. And that's it in terms of flaws. No, really. Aside from that, I actually love Nights into Dreams despite its flaws, mainly because there are a lot of really good or fantastic aspects about it. First of all, the graphics for both the original and remastered versions are actually quite great. They're colorful and detailed, the environments are varied and lively, and the animations for Nights are really nice to look at. Though I will admit that the remastered graphics are better, mostly because things such as enemies and pre-rendered effects fit in much better with the rest of the game, as opposed to the slightly out-of-place versions seen with the original graphics. Another great upside are the CGI cutscenes. Yes, it's obvious they were made in the mid-90s, but for their time, they're actually really good. There's a ton of detail to be found, the animations are actually kind of smooth, and they get across the story and feeling very effectively without any dialogue whatsoever. Honestly, it's not that surprising that with cutscenes this good at the time that we ended up with the amazing CGI that Sega's become known for these days. The gameplay in general is also very fun with smooth controls, a nice balance of challenge, meaning that it's easy for anyone to get into, but also very difficult to really master, and a lot of replayability from replaying the levels over and over to earn the best possible score to get to the end of the game. It's unbelievably addictive, and because of its really easygoing nature, it's also a very relaxing game to play. Something that damn well needs to be said about Nights into Dreams is that one of its greatest aspects is its atmosphere. I'm not exactly sure what it is about it, but the game's general mood and atmosphere is really quite unique. Rather fittingly, there's a dreamlike serenity to everything in the game. From its music, to its graphics, to even the lack of dialogue, the overall tone of the game is very surreal but also inviting. and I think this helps get people in the mood for the game because it really does feel like you've gone off to another world altogether. However, probably the best thing about the entire game is its soundtrack. Composed mainly by Tomoko Sasaki, who handled the similarly surreal music for Rystar, but also by Naofumi Hataya, who composed soundtracks to games such as Golden Axe 2, Space Channel 5, and the Japanese/European OST for Sonic CD, and Fumi Kumatani, who handled a lot of music for the Sonic Adventure games. The music for Nights into Dreams is utterly amazing. Like I said before, the music helps add to the dreamlike quality of the game. The melodies are really catchy and change in subtle ways every time you replay the levels. They're very nice to listen to, and in particular, the credits theme Dreams Dreams is one of my all-time favorite video game themes just due to how fantastic it is to listen to. Nights into Dreams HD is a fantastic game with really good graphics for both the remastered and original versions, very fun gameplay, nice CGI cutscenes, a very serene atmosphere, and utterly amazing music. However, it's let down by weak bosses, a short length, missing content from the original game, and being rather impenetrable to get into at first. But even so, if you're a fan of very stylized, unique games that involve getting the highest score possible, or both, I sincerely demand that you buy Nights into Dreams from the nearest available service. I give this game a rating of bloody brilliant, an amazing game with only a few problems holding it back. I'm Bardoodle9000, and I hope you enjoy watching this review. Until we meet again, have a great day, y'all!